The year was 2005. Capcom was a world-renowned video game company for their masterful take on survival horror with the Resident Evil franchise, and they had just come out with Resident Evil 4, a game that received critical acclaim in spite of its many years of troubled development. It was celebrated for reinventing the franchise and revolutionizing third-person camera games while staying true to the feeling of horror the series was known for. The combat was reinvented with intuitive ideas, making the action more accessible and giving you new ways to fight off enemies. The levels were breathtaking, showcasing creepy atmosphere and open spaces for combat, allowing the player to make the most out of this redesign of the series' gameplay. It had entertaining boss battles, pushing players to utilize all of their skills to overcome these challenging encounters. And the game boasted a lot of replay value with post-game content like a new campaign featuring a new playable character, unlockable weapons, a new Game Plus feature that would allow you to carry over all your stuff to a new playthrough, and a bonus mode called Mercenaries. It's been re-released time and time again, allowing gamers to experience it through multiple console generations, and maintains a powerful presence in video game culture. It is universally considered one of the greatest video games ever made, and a fascinating evolution to the Resident Evil formula. So what do I think of it? It's pretty mid.
Move this man!
Now, before people start jumping down my throat for daring to speak ill of the legendary RE4, I want to preface this video by saying I don't hate this game. I wouldn't even say I dislike it, as I feel it would be unfair. I still have respect for Resident Evil 4 for the positive influence it had on third-person video games, and for the dozens of ways it revolutionized survival horror and made way for new ideas and innovations for the genre. But there's so many outdated elements that have grown stale over time. I know the game was revolutionary when it came out, but now there's just so many things wrong with it. Things that I hope you come to understand as we move further into the video. In spite of my indifference in RE4, I was always curious about the idea of the game being remade. The pieces are there for it to work. It just needs more up-to-date touches and modern updates to things like the control scheme and combat, while removing the more egregious features of the original game. It wasn't until June 2022 that Capcom announced that it would be bringing back the legendary title in the form of a full-fledged remake. After the success of the RE2 remake and the less than impressive RE3 remake, Capcom decided to come full circle by adapting one of their most renowned titles with the same love that was given to RE2. On one hand, my curiosity and interest was grabbed by this project. They seemed to be doing things with the game that could help to make it an improvement over the original. On the other hand, there was also the possibility that they wouldn't really add anything new and just make it the same game but with better graphics. If upgraded visuals was the only thing they were gonna do with it, then I was gonna skip out on it entirely. But as more trailers came out and more gameplay was released, my worries were put to rest, as it looked like they were actually taking steps to make the game more accessible while not alienating fans of the original. Things like the ability to crouch to dodge certain enemy attacks, stealth kills, and refurbishing the role of Leon's knife by giving it a more proactive role in gameplay all seem like smart choices to add something new to the game. For the first time ever, I was actually really genuinely interested in RE4 with all the ways they were spicing it up and making it more interesting. And with the recent success of the Dead Space remake, I had pretty good hopes that this game would receive the same treatment. And after finally finishing it, I can safely say this game was an incredible experience. I've been seeing it receive a lot of praise across the internet for its ability to stay faithful to the original while also making it feel refreshing to give this remake a reason to exist. And this widely positive reception is very well deserved. I don't think this needs to be a full-on review of the game to get my point across, as there's plenty of people who have already talked about this game's excellence. This will be more of a comparison between the original and the remake, to see how the remake takes things people liked about the original and expands on them to make it a more satisfying experience. So it's safe to say this video will be heavily categorized as to stay focused on select topics, where we go over each aspect of the game one by one. So let's not stall any more time. Let's get this minecart moving and talk about how the Resident Evil 4 remake fixes the original. Now, I don't really think of the story to be a problem in the original game. In fact, I'd actually say it's an enjoyably cheesy experience. The cheesiness and ridiculousness is just the standard that you come to expect from the series, so RE4's hamminess isn't out of the ordinary. If anything, it helps to make the story more enjoyable. From the one-liners to the dumb ways characters interact with each other, it helps create a balance in tone while fitting into the action horror feel of the overall game. The basic premise is that it takes place 6 years after the events of RE2 and 3, where Leon has undergone extreme top-secret military training to become a hardened government agent. He's sent to Europe to find the president's missing daughter and is brought to a local village where the residents have been turned into a murderous cult. So now Leon must shoot and kick his way through hordes of mutated citizens and other monsters to rescue Ashley, while fighting off a virus injected into his system to turn him into one of the cultists. In spite of the game's overall cheesiness, it still stays true to the horror aspect of the series. It begins with you entering an unfamiliar house where you investigate a local. It slowly builds up to him attacking you without warning, and after defeating him you learn about how disturbed and unsettling this village is. Mutilated bodies, disgusting living styles, and the citizens are acting brainless in spite of not being actual zombies. And when you reach the big encounter in the village, you see the body of one of Leon's escorts being set on fire and burning away. It's a really unsettling sight that gives you a reason to be afraid. The encounter itself is reasonably challenging while having that sense of horror. There's a lot of enemies outnumbering you, but you're encouraged to avoid fighting them while running around the area. Keeping your distance and only opening fire as a last resort is a way of keeping the player on their toes and taking a conservative approach to enemy encounters. It's a really iconic opening for its ability to establish its tone and letting the player adapt to the changes to the gameplay formula. And the game has some pretty strong and atmospheric sections where the horror aspect shines through. The filthy mugginess of the village, the dark corners of the castle, the unsettling laboratories on the island. RE4 is advertised as a more action-oriented horror title, but stuff like this allows it to feel like a game that belongs in Resident Evil. There's also a lot of well-animated deaths showcasing the many horrific ways Leon can die. In spite of being more action-focused, RE4 maintains that feel of survival horror with gloomy backgrounds, foreboding music, and scary deaths. As for the actual story, it's acceptable. It's really over the top and dumb, but it's harmless in its execution. Unfortunately, it's awkwardly paced, and a lot of the characters come across as generic. Some of them stand out better than others, like Louis being highly charismatic and Leon being a cheesy action hero. But the majority of the other characters are just tools for moving the story forward. They don't have entertaining personalities or clear motivations, which results in a lot of it feeling rushed. None of them are really explored in cutscenes, and any explanations for who they are and how they're involved in events of the game are exclusive to files you can end up missing. But I think what everyone really likes is how stunningly cinematic the game feels. The graphics themselves are pretty state-of-the-art for the 5th console generation, but the main selling point is definitely the more lifelike movement of character models. Obviously, due to the limitations of technology, the characters in the PS1 era were extremely robotic and stiff, something that's elevated really well in this game. They use motion capture to add more dimensions to the body language and character expression, and it's really satisfying to see how far the technology evolved with just this one entry. It can also be felt in the combat with a lot of fidelity and weight to Leon's attacks. It makes for a much more realistic and flexible battle system and a huge upgrade from the fixed angles in the original trilogy. The camera work and cinematography is also really enjoyable. The horror scenes are slow and progressively build up to the scares, while the action set pieces are appropriately fast-paced. It makes the overall experience more of an interactive movie with scenes that allow you to relax and enjoy some cool story beats in between gameplay sections. It's a lot of fun to watch in spite of the clunky writing. So how exactly does the remake improve upon this element? I think the best way to say that is that it expands on things that were needed to make it interesting. It still has a lot of the elements I mentioned before. The excellent cinematography, rural atmosphere, creepy enemies, cheesy one-liners, graphic death animations, and well-orchestrated music. But what the remake adds on top of that makes the story more proficient. It develops the characters further, gives them more personality, explores their motivations within cutscenes, delves into the lore and backstory of the Illuminados cult at a deeper level, all while never losing sight of the cheesy action horror tone. It comes across as more dramatic and character-driven while also remaining faithful to fans of the original version. Leon, for example, still has elements of being an over-the-top action hero, but he's also given a more methodical character arc. He's shown to suffer from bad memories and PTSD from the incident in Raccoon City, having things like survivor's guilt and seeking redemption by saving people when he previously failed to do so. It helps make him more believable and easier to gravitate to, as these are things that would realistically happen as someone who endured a traumatic event. Him acting like an action hero quipping one-liners is actually a way of helping him cope with his past experiences. He also has a more thoughtful and less one-sided relationship with Ashley. Instead of just being her bodyguard, he takes the time to interact with her on a personal level. The chemistry they have both during cutscenes and real-time gameplay is very well written, and it enhances your desire to keep her safe from harm. We'll get more into Ashley in a moment, as I believe she deserves her own section, but for now I'll say her deeper and more detailed relationship with Leon is really effective in getting you to care for her well-being, instead of just being a game mechanic forced on the player. Both Leon and Ashley's characters are greatly expanded on, making them more three-dimensional than back in 2005. Leon gets to deal with his trauma from Raccoon City while overcoming his inner struggle to become a more proficient warrior, and Ashley develops a real bond with Leon over the course of the story, with a more caring and competent personality. And it's not just Leon and Ashley, other characters are given more depth too. The most prominent example being Lewis. In the original, he was just this mystery guy who got involved with the cultists and his role was never explored in cutscenes. In the remake, not only do they keep his snarky personality intact, but they also take the time to develop him in the story. He was a researcher in Umbrella who went into hiding after the Raccoon City incident, looking for a way to right his wrongs. His involvement with Ada is also explored in cutscenes instead of making it exclusive to missable files, as we get to see the two interacting with each other through dialogue. He's also more present throughout the story, allowing him to have better chemistry with Leon. They share a more interesting partnership instead of him popping in and out of the story at random times, and his death scene is handled a lot better. Unlike the original, where he randomly pops up after being absent for several hours just to die immediately, the remake does a really good job building up to his death. There's actually an entire chapter of him and Leon working together. They fight groups of Illuminados cultists, and even the boss battle with the two giants is repurposed to have Lewis involved in the fight. This is practically one of the best chapters in the game, as it really feels like Lewis has your back during enemy encounters. The way the two interact with each other during combat and story bits helps the relationship to feel a lot more explored compared to the original, and the last conversation between the two has much more in-depth and meaningful dialogue. Resident Evil 4 Remake transforms Lewis from a random third party into a tragic hero seeking redemption alongside Leon. Everything he does in the story makes sense now, and his role in the narrative is given more care. The original acts like he never existed after his death, and he's never mentioned again outside of optional notes. But in the remake, his presence is able to linger into the game's final moments in a way that feels deserved. It's undoubtedly one of the things that was done absolutely better. Krauser, Leon's old partner, also has more presence in cutscenes. Their relationship is explored more thoroughly with brand new dialogue and more references to the Dark Side Chronicles, the game that helps to explain how he became evil. This version of Krauser feels more human with new files and story dialogue, giving a better sense of purpose to his role in the story. Even Lord Sadler is made into a much more interesting villain. His personality is more menacing, but also more cultist and zealot-like. He's changed from a generic power-driven megalomaniac to an actual religious fanatic, with the culture of Los Illuminados being expanded and explored more thoroughly. Just about every plotline and character is greatly improved on, and the remake does this without making any drastic changes to the original. The overall plot has the same story beats and outcomes, with a few notable changes to how events play out, but these changes don't do anything to take away from what made the original iconic. It's a far more entertaining story that makes revisiting the world of RE4 a more engaging and more rewarding experience. Here's something I bet you've never heard before. Ashley in the original Resident Evil 4 is horrendously awful. She is regarded as one of the worst video game characters of all time, as just about every element surrounding her presence in the game drags the overall experience down to an unbearable level. Her grating voice, bland personality, over-reliance on the player, inability to do anything by herself, how she does almost nothing to help Leon over the course of the game. It's practically legendary how horrible she is. Both in terms of story and gameplay mechanics, she nearly ruins the entire game, as she's nothing but a burden on the player. And I am so relieved that Ashley in the remake is absolutely nothing like that. I said in the earlier segment that she's given more personality and interesting presence in the story, but now we can fully explore what makes this version of Ashley so much easier to tolerate. In terms of story, she's much more proactive and smart. In the original version, when she first meets Leon, she just runs into a corner and throws a stick.
A stick?
In the remake, she puts much more effort into defending herself and attempting to fight off Leon, hiding behind the door waiting to attack him from behind. And instead of throwing a hollow wooden stick, she swings a blunt object. She's also more hesitant to trust Leon, as she doesn't know who he is and has no proof to trust him yet. Her trust issue in this situation is much more believable than gleefully joining him just for mentioning her dad. And that horrible scene where she coughs blood before pushing away Leon, whining for him to leave her alone before running straight into a trap, is replaced with a really creepy demonstration of how the parasite begins to take control of its host. After coughing up blood, the effects of the parasite begin to affect her as she becomes mind-controlled and grabs Leon's knife, attacking him. And when she regains consciousness, she's terrified of her actions, running away out of guilt over hurting Leon and fear of becoming something inhuman. It leads to them having a conversation about overcoming self-doubt and fear when they reunite, which is really nice. Nothing like this ever happened in the OG, and it helps to establish a genuine relationship between the two. She also puts effort into helping Leon during certain combat scenarios. In your first encounter with the knight, she throws the blue lanterns from the balcony, which leads to the discovery that the blue fire stuns them. There's a real sense of teamwork during this battle, as Ashley can keep the knights from overwhelming you and stunning them so you can focus on a single target. Even the part where you control her feels like a step up from the original. Not only did they get rid of that horrible slide puzzle, but they added a few new mechanics and features to make this segment interesting. Using the blue lanterns to stun the knights, puzzles that are fun to solve without being tedious, and new locations like the library and the lantern shrine. It also maintains that edge of your seat tension and anxiety from the original, keeping the player on their toes to keep Ashley from taking damage from the knights. Oh, and remember all those times Leon needed to catch Ashley? All those times she couldn't climb down a ladder or jump down 5 feet because she's such a stupid bimbo? Well, that's no longer an issue. Ashley in the remake is able to voluntarily climb down ladders or jump down short distances without needing Leon to catch her every 5 minutes. It speeds up the pacing of the game knowing that you don't have to constantly run over to Ashley to catch her, and it also demonstrates a better sense of independence on her behalf. Finally, there's the improvements to the mechanics surrounding how Leon gives her orders. In the original game, he could command her to stand still or follow him. In the remake, he can command her to follow him up close or spread out and follow him from a further distance. This is an important improvement to how Ashley's AI behaves, as she's always moving around and making an effort to avoid getting hit or captured. The original Ashley could only act based on what Leon tells her to do, which results in her being left vulnerable all the time. She either stands still like a useless cabbage, allowing anyone to walk up to her and abduct her, or not doing anything to dodge attacks when close to Leon. The parts where you have to keep her safe are undoubtedly the worst parts of the original game, as keeping track of not just Leon's well-being but also hers is made into a repetitive chore. You can order her to hide in lockers and garbage bins to avoid enemy detection, but there aren't a lot of areas where you can do that. There's also another important difference between OG Ashley and her remake version. OG Ashley has a health bar and takes twice as much damage as Leon from enemy attacks. Ashley in the remake doesn't have a health bar. Instead, she becomes incapacitated if attacked, in which Leon must go to her and help her to her feet before she's attacked again. Because of this, she can survive enemy attacks indefinitely, making keeping her safe a lot less stressful. She can still die if attacked while incapacitated, but the game gives her enough invincibility frames, giving the player a generous amount of time to save her. It's also a lot better in terms of managing resources. Since Ashley no longer has a health bar, you no longer have to worry about wasting healing items on her. All of these things put together make Ashley a much more fun addition to both the story and gameplay. Ashley in the original was an obnoxious damsel in distress, who was nothing but a burden on the player. In the remake, they take all of the right steps to improve her without doing too much to change her. She's still a damsel for Leon to safeguard, but is much more capable and less of a burden. She's more independent, she has more interesting mechanics, she can survive enemy attacks more easily, and she's written to be much more interesting. They stay true to her role in the original while making her more fun and pleasant to be around. Gone are the days of her constantly screeching for help, replaced with a more defined companion, making Ashley into the character she was always meant to be. A cute and vulnerable, but proactive teammate who helps make Resident Evil 4 a pleasant experience to revisit. I decided to ultimately give the knife its own section of discussion, as I ended up finding a lot to say about the differences between the two games with this particular mechanic. In the original trilogy, the knife was a resource that would take up space in your inventory, forcing you to manage between holding onto it and collecting other items. But in RE4, the knife is its own separate weapon, concealed on Leon's holster instead of an item that can be stored in the case. The way it works is that you hold one of the shoulder buttons and he'll deploy the knife, and pressing the fire button allows him to perform a horizontal swipe attack. This can be used to attack enemies and even stun them if you hit them in the face. You can also use the knife to attack down enemies as they're lying on the ground struggling to get back up. For a video game series that encourages the player to reserve resources, this is a great way to deal damage to enemies without using up bullets. Headshot an enemy, melee attack them knocking them down, and then run up and knife them while they're down. There was one notable flaw to the knife though. Using it is really sluggish. Performing the horizontal slash in repetition feels really slow. Like you should be dealing damage more quickly, but you're restricted by the slow movement of the animation. And this is where the remake comes in. It may be grating to OG fans that the knife is back to being an inventory item that takes up space in your case, but what the remake lacks in resource, it makes up greatly in gameplay mechanics. Leon's knife is 10 times more efficient this time around, and it plays a significantly larger role in combat compared to the OG. It can now be used more quickly by simply pressing the fire button, no longer requiring the player to hold down one of the shoulder buttons to use it. The horizontal attack is also much faster in the remake, making using the knife less sluggish. It may be just by half a second, but trust me when I say that half a second makes a really big difference in attack speed. You can also perform a faster stab attack by holding down the shoulder button before pressing the attack button. Additionally, there's a brand new mechanic involving the knife in which Leon can use it to quickly break out of enemy attacks. Instead of having to repeatedly mash a button, you can use the knife knife to quickly stab an enemy and break free. It's quicker and a lot easier on the thumbs. Finally, there's a new attack Leon can use on stunned enemies when he's close enough, where he can stab them in the neck to deal large damage or insta-kill them. It's a useful technique for quickly dispatching enemies and reducing their numbers. But the knife isn't just for attacking, it can also be used defensively. The remake introduces a new parrying system in which you can use Leon's knife to block or deflect certain enemy attacks. With a time press of the shoulder button, Leon can use the knife to knock back enemies using melee attacks and to parry projectiles. It adds a whole new layer of muscle memory and decision making for combat, adding to the possibilities of what the player can do in battle. It even works on saving Leon from instantly dying from chainsaw attacks. When I first saw this in the reveal trailer, I was highly impressed and amazed with this mechanic. It's something that gives the knife a greater sense of purpose other than reserving ammunition. It can be used to save the player in critical situations, as well as making Leon look even more like an experienced veteran. His ability to react quickly enough to block the chainsaw while also having enough physical strength to hold it back makes him an even greater badass than he was previously. It's really satisfying to see unfold, and it makes fighting chainsaw enemies even more intuitive and entertaining. Now, the trade-off to all this is that the knife is supposed to have limited durability and becomes weaker with multiple uses, and you have to spend money to repair it at the merchant. This is a good trade-off as it adds decision-making to the combat, deciding when and how to use the knife for encounters. It keeps the knife from being too overpowered by setting a limit for how many times it can be used. It's also possible to collect different knives on the field, ones that can be used to reserve the main one with less durability, but fairly frequent appearances as you explore. And if you don't like this limitation, you can obtain the primal knife and unlock its infinite durability perk. The knife in RE4 Remake is more than just a tool. It's a whole Swiss Army knife with a lot of utility and options behind it. There's so many possibilities with it now, with a lot of tremendous additions and improvements to how it works. The knife alone would be enough to point out how much Capcom cared about building upon the original, but as we'll soon see, there's plenty of other things they tweaked in the right direction. Before I directly delve into the OG's problems, I suppose it's only fair to go over what people love about it being so revolutionary. And to the game's credit, it is revolutionary. Comparing the original trilogy to 4 is like night and day in terms of how different they are. No more fixed camera angles, no more door-opening loading screens, no more ink ribbons required to save progress, and no more shooting mechanics limited by the original trilogy's horrible fixed camera system. RE4's significant shift to third-person view results in laser-accurate gunplay. You can freely aim where you fire your gun and target specific body parts of enemies. Shoot them in the arm to stun them. Shoot them in the leg, causing them to trip and fall. Headshot them and follow up with a melee attack. This gameplay was unlike anything else in the industry at the time, which allows it to have a unique identity. RE4 also introduces currency, money you can collect from breakable objects and defeated enemies. This can be used for purchasing weapon upgrades to make you feel stronger over the course of the game, giving the player a satisfying feeling of progress. If you're having trouble farming money, you can make more by finding treasure scattered throughout the game. It adds an element of exploration that rewards the player for taking the time to observe their surroundings and thoroughly inspecting every corner. And there's more to it than that. Not only can you sell treasures individually, but you can also combine certain treasures together to increase their selling value. In the original trilogy, we weren't used to the idea of upgrading our stuff to become stronger, because that option was never available to us. All we could do is find a weapon while exploring the area, and its firepower would stay that way throughout the game. But now we do have the ability to make our weapons more powerful. It's a really good addition to the formula that adds an RPG element to Resident Evil and makes the gunplay more complex. It really sells the idea that RE4 is more than just a horror title. It's a horror-themed action-adventure game. And this can be felt through all the new additions to the player's ability to act on the field. You can vault over fences, push over ladders, jump through windows, dodge enemy attacks, and jump down from a ledge instead of climbing down a ladder. It's a really huge change to the norm, but it's all done in service of the faster pacing and direction of the gameplay. Another addition to the formula is the inclusion of a HUD that displays your stats, including your health and remaining shots in your gun. No longer will you have to pause the game to look over your health and remaining ammo. It's always on screen for you to quickly keep checkout. As a result of the game's new third-person camera, you now have a wider scope of the environments you explore, and you have the ability to look around to observe and keep track of where you are. The areas you explore are also largely connected zones, a huge difference from the smaller spaces in the original trilogy. Making the fields larger and more expansive works wonders for the combat as you're given more wiggle room to act and react to your situation. Distancing yourself from enemies, running away if you don't want to engage with them, or even lining up your shots to perform a headshot melee combo. Combat is made more strategic with these wider areas where it's possible to use the environment to your advantage, providing the player with more offensive options than in previous games. Other features include the ability to combine the new yellow herb with green and red ones to increase your maximum health, adding another RPG element to help you feel stronger over the course of the game. Combat in general is much more dynamic with the introduction of third-person controls, giving the player the freedom to set up different strategies that involve getting in the right position. It's more reliant on your spacing and awareness of your surroundings rather than just distancing yourself from enemies. And this is something highlighted during the opening raid. The purpose of the village raid is to help the player learn and adjust to the game's new battle mechanics and how different it feels from previous titles. Because of the original PlayStation's weaker hardware, the original trilogy never had a situation where you would be attacked by large groups of enemies at one time. Now, not only are you being attacked by hordes of enemies, but the enemies in question aren't zombies as foreshadowed earlier. The Illuminados cult is a very human-like threat that uses its own strategies and tactics against Leon. They plan and think about how they're going to kill him instead of just behaving like a mindless husk. It's a much more interesting concept than fighting zombies that slowly walk toward you. It's actually a much more interesting premise considering this was a series defined by making the player feel scared and vulnerable. It opens up a massive realm of possibilities for the combat and sets a new status quo for third-person games in general. This formula was so iconic for its time that many games are still using it to this day. The over-the-shoulder gunplay combined with a more open-space combat system would make way to become a staple in many other titles to follow in RE4's footsteps. It really speaks volumes of its influence and the way it revolutionized the gaming industry as a whole. Resident Evil 4 is without question one of the most important video games ever made, as the industry as we know it would not be where it is without its influence. Capcom practically set the standard for how third-person games are made now, forever changing a formula that was previously growing tired and stale. It transformed third-person into a fully realized gaming experience, much like Halo did for first-person. So, since I spent the entire section praising and paying respect to Resident Evil 4 and what made it a beloved title, now it's safe for me to talk about how it aged poorly and how the remake fixes it. As I said before, I'm not oblivious to how revolutionary this game was when it came out, but there's a lot of things in terms of gameplay that aged badly, the most notable being its tank controls. Even as far back as the original trilogy, Resident Evil was plagued with really slow and clunky tank controls in which you had to operate your character like, well, a tank. Instead of freely moving around in different directions, you had to slowly rotate your character in order to change course of where you would move. The only direction you could quickly adjust to is behind you with a 180 turn. And even then, you were still limited by the tank controls and nature of the camera. The idea behind the camera is that it's supposed to operate like how a normal person would look around in real life. Up, down, left, and right without fully turning. People will praise this for being realistic and immersive, but it doesn't benefit the player to restrict how far you can turn the camera. What if I want to look back behind me without performing a 180 turn, like what you can do in Dead Space? It's faster and more thoughtful that you can freely operate the camera without having to adjust where your character is facing. And this is the first important change the remake makes, completely removing the tank controls. The player now has full control over the camera and how far they can turn it without adjusting where Leon is facing. And instead of operating like a tank, Leon is able to freely move left and right like a normal person. You can still perform a quick 180 turn if that's what you prefer, but it's a very helpful change that improves Leon's mobility. It also gives you the ability to dodge enemy attacks by being able to sway left and right more quickly. Like if you see an enemy throwing an axe, you didn't have to worry about shooting it. You can just run to the side to avoid it. It helps improve the player's ability to react to enemy actions and create a better window for dodging attacks. Another significant improvement is how shotguns perform. In the original, there was no real effect to how close up you were to an enemy when firing a shotgun, as they pretty much deal the same damage regardless of your distance, making them unreliable in terms of damage dealing. This problem is fully elevated in the remake. Shotgun blasts at close range deal immensely more damage, making them feel more useful as a hard-hitting firearm. It feels more consistent with how you'd expect a shotgun to function in games like this, and it's really helpful in conserving ammo. The next big fix is the ability to reload your weapon while moving around. As were in the original, you were forced in an immobilized state. On some level, I can understand why a player wouldn't want to move while aiming, as it could throw off their accuracy, but there's really no reason to not let the player move while reloading. It needlessly leaves you vulnerable to enemy attacks instead of allowing you to multitask and avoid taking damage. Giving Leon the ability to reload his weapon while also being allowed to move around was a much needed addition for how it largely benefits the player. Next, and most importantly, the remake completely does away with the original's horrendously awful quick time events, or QTEs for short. QTEs have been regarded as one of the worst tropes in video games for their inability to enhance the action of gameplay, instead acting as a hindrance by interrupting story beats during cutscenes or randomly popping up during gameplay, and the OG RE4 is amongst the worst offenders. In the original, QTEs were done for three things: dodging enemy attacks, breaking out of enemy attacks, and avoiding death during a cutscene. They involve time presses or repeatedly mashing a button, which is not only tiresome, but it offsets the tone of the game. Story cutscenes are meant to give the player breathing room and relax for a moment, letting them collect themselves before resuming gameplay. But not in OG RE4. This game is filled with dozens of QTEs that will result in an instant game over if the game decides you didn't react fast enough, which is especially egregious given how they not only give you a small fraction of a second to perform the button prompt, but the first time you're playing through this game you'll have no way of seeing them coming. There's no warning for unsuspecting players, and even people familiar with them aren't allowed to simply sit back and enjoy the campiness of the story. It's even worse during gameplay, as in a lot of instances the QTE prompt is only on screen for a few frames, not giving you nearly enough time to press the button on time. You could blink and miss it, resulting in unfair damage. And there's so many instances of these horrible QTEs throughout the game that it's impossible to avoid them. This was thankfully removed in the remake. Cutscenes play out naturally, with no instances of button prompts resulting in death. Breaking out of enemy attacks is made faster by using the knife instead of button prompts, allowing you to quickly free yourself and reserve health. And dodging certain enemy attacks has been substituted with knife parrying. With the exception of a very small number of enemies, you're not required to follow a button prompt to dodge or break enemy attacks, which feels a lot more satisfying and skill-based. The original also had this other problem involving multiple actions tied to the same button. And to understand what I mean by that, here's an example of Leon not being able to go down a ladder because there's an item right in front of it. Picking up an item and interacting with the environment are mapped to the same button, meaning that the game can't distinguish between the player wanting to pick up ammo or if they want to get past an obstacle. I played through the remake in preparation for this video and there was never an instance of this happening. It could be because there was more thought put into spacing out areas and enemy encounters involving these types of environments, but it never gets you stuck with a screen saying you picked up an item instead of trying to jump down a ladder. Even breaking breakable objects is a lot faster in the remake. You no longer have to holster your knife in order to break open boxes and barrels to collect the items inside. You just walk up to it and press the X button. And as a result of the removal of QTEs, the first encounter with Krauser is made into one of the remake's biggest highlights. The knife fight against him is changed from a horrible compilation of QTEs and made into a straight up boss fight that pushes your skills with the knife to the limit. It's an incredible boss fight that acts as a fun test of your muscle memory and timing with the knife, where you actually have to engage with Krauser and anticipate his movements. It makes for a great shift in gameplay while maintaining the pacing of the original. Aiming is also a lot faster due to removing the tank controls. Instead of starting your aiming based on where Leon is faced, you can quickly aim in any direction based on how you position the camera. It allows you to snap to a certain target more quickly and maintain more focus on them than having to adjust your position before doing so. Much like in the original, you can still explore areas for treasure and combine them to increase their value, but the remake adds a new spin to help make it more interesting. You can mix and match up to 6 different types of gems to fit into treasure you find, and you're given bonuses depending on which combinations you use. Different combos result in different values, so it's interesting to see which ones are best for your situation and what you can afford. And while item management can still be an annoying aspect of the game that requires you to stop playing every few minutes to sort out items in Leon's case, the remake includes the ability to auto-sort items to make it a little faster. You can quickly adjust where everything is positioned in a categorized order, which helps to improve the pacing even if it's just by a small margin. There's also the addition of the stealth mechanic. Unlike other features in this game that were revamped from the original, stealth was something that wasn't present at all. The ability to crouch and quietly sneak around areas while avoiding detection, and the ability to instantly kill certain enemies by attacking from behind. Now, stealth in video games is something I've always had a rocky relationship with, as it's almost never executed properly. It's always really slow, with a lot of ways you can be screwed over for reasons that have nothing to do with your skill. And I have to admit, it's really not that big of a game changer here. It mostly just amounts to every other stealth system we've seen before, just crouching and slowly sneaking around and avoiding detection. It doesn't really do anything to drastically change enemy encounters. But while the stealth might not be an interesting addition to the game, the ability to craft items certainly is. Much like RE4 Remake, you now have the ability to create ammo and grenades using resources you collect on the field, which is a very much needed addition as it eliminates the stress of running out of items in a situation where you'd need them. Did you run out of flash grenades while fighting parasite enemies? Just use resources to craft another one. Run out of ammo for your shotgun? Use crafting to make some more. It adds a huge branch of decision making with all sorts of recipes for you to try out, and giving you an edge in battle that even the original didn't offer. Speaking of battle, the remake makes things interesting with the addition of new enemy types and behaviors. The red zealots, for example, no longer behave like the black ones. They have a new role in combat where they chant and transform black zealots into parasite enemies. Dealing with them suddenly becomes a top priority, adding tension and urgency to enemy encounters. It gives them a more prominent role rather than just make them copies of the black zealots with more HP. The Iranaplagus is also given a new role. Instead of behaving like other Plagus enemies that pop out of an enemy's head, they attach themselves to an enemy's back, causing them to act frantic and run at Leon mindlessly. It's really nerving whenever they show up, as they can make combat situations more tense and dangerous. Even villagers have a new ability in which they lay more bear traps in the middle of a battle, setting up traps to catch you off guard and add an element of surprise. It's actually really nice to know the people behind this remake took the time to give us something new. It's sort of like the Dead Space remake, where the changes and additions are noticeable but not overwhelming. It allows the combat to remain familiar to fans of the original while also throwing in a few surprises. Another improvement over the original is the jet ski escape at the end of the game, where you have to avoid obstacles or else you instantly die. In the remake, you don't instantly die. The jet ski is instead given its own health bar, so you can survive getting hit several times. In the original, this was a terribly executed segment, as the game forced you to go at top speed or else you die from the water wave coming from behind. And because you were forced to go at top speed the whole time, you have bad control over your steering. In the remake, that tidal wave is no longer there, so you're not forced to go at top speed the entire time. The remake understands that there's already a time limit to escaping the island before it explodes, and that the player didn't need another ticking clock on top of that, so you're able to get through the jet ski segment at your own leisure. With a better handle over your speed, you can more easily steer left and right to avoid hitting obstacles. And here's another thing that's made better in the remake: throwing grenades. In terms of mechanics, it's the same as the original. Manipulate a group of enemies to huddle together before throwing it to kill a wave of enemies at one time. But the remake adds something that's crucial to using grenades: a white line that shows the exact trajectory of your grenade throw and where it lands. In the original, there was no trajectory line that would show the grenade's pathway. They could end up throwing it too far to the left or right, or it could end up ricocheting off of something and not land in a good spot. This one small change in the remake does so much to help out the player, making grenade throwing more precise and reliable. And another improvement, the minecart segment. In the original, you had to ride across the castle mines in a cart where enemies would jump in and swarm you from multiple directions. It was an extremely egregious portion of the game, as you were forced to fight hordes of enemies in a closed up space, on top of being vigilant of QTEs to avoid hitting boarded up pathways. In the remake, the minecart ride is changed into something of a minigame. You team up with Lewis while riding in the cart and keeping enemies from hitting you and avoiding obstacles along the way. Shooting explosive barrels, changing the tracks to avoid hitting a dead end, keeping the cart from flying off the rails by tilting it, and no QTEs to interrupt the action. It's a lot more interesting, as it gives the minecart its own separate gameplay mechanics instead of making it another generic battle sequence. The remake even puts in the effort to completely remove segments that were downright horrible in the original: the Gatling gun in the castle, the bulldozer on the island, the U3 boss fight, the laser hallway, the boulder running, that giant fight where you had to fight it in a narrow area while protecting Ashley, the cage trap next to the dining hall, outrunning the Salazar statue, all of which were badly designed and not fun to engage with in any way. Another fun change from the original is how the remake replaces bottle caps with charms you can attach to your case. It gives the player more of a reason to participate in the shooting gallery, as these charms add perks and stat boosts to Leon, providing you with another RPG element to make the gameplay more fun. There's a plentiful variety of charms to win, each with their own unique perk. It adds an element of experimentation, as you can mix and match which different charms you'd like to use and which ones are best for your situation. And for all my previous talk about the stealth not being a big deal, it does help make battles with the Garrador more interesting. The main appeal to fighting this enemy was always about being sneaky and quiet while hitting its weak point, something that was really slow in the original due to the game's tank controls and the enemy constantly turning its back away from your line of fire. In the remake, you don't have to worry about shooting him from a distance. You can sneak up on him and damage him using the knife. It's a more fitting and practical way to fight them, as you don't have to worry about causing too much noise with your guns. I also found it to be a lot faster, since approaching him silently instead of distancing yourself from him is a more guaranteed way to prevent his back from being turned on you. As for the puzzles, they're more or less the same. Pretty much every puzzle from the OG version is brought back for the remake, so if there was a certain puzzle you liked, you don't have to worry about it being discluded. But here's something about the original that I cannot stress enough: the hitboxes are horrendously awful. There's plenty of instances where A, your shots don't register, B, enemy attacks hit you through walls, or C, you take damage from attacks that absolutely did not touch you. It breaks the game in so many different situations where you take damage as a result of faulty design, especially if you're playing it on higher difficulties. I don't know how no one ever talked about this problem when talking about RE4, because this is something that should absolutely be addressed. Remember, This was from a time where games couldn't be fixed later with an update patch. You had to deal with the way the game came out, glitches and all, no matter how game-breaking they were. Finally, and this might just be a me thing, but the enemy AI in the original was incredibly brain-dead. There's so many ways you can exploit their AI and take advantage of their linear design, making them complete pushovers. For one thing, enemies that throw explosives do so brainlessly. All they do is just spam this attack regardless if you're in range of the explosive. And they have a really bad habit of blowing up their own teammates. There's also instances where you can easily trick them into killing themselves with their own traps. Like they just mindlessly walk into explosive tripwires without walking around them. You also have ways of exploiting their detection boxes to make it so you fight them one by one instead of in a group. Like in the area where you fight the second chainsaw guy, there's a whole bunch of enemies stationed along the pathway leading to the gate. But if you slowly nudge forward little by little, you can trick enemies into fighting Leon one by one instead of in a group. You'd think there would be at least a small group going after you when one of them spots you and calls you out. But nope, you can just repeat this nudging thing for every single enemy along the path. And you can also trap the chainsaw guy in a loop where you can easily stun lock him by doing a 180 turn and running just as you hear him readying his attack, then 180 turn again and shoot him in the head while he's in a staggering animation. Exploits like this just take away from the idea that Los Illuminados are supposed to be smarter and more of a threat than the zombies you fought in the original trilogy, making them look even more brainless and less threatening. Even their basic behavior during battle is really linear and generic. There's no complexity or variety to how they behave. 80% of enemies in this game either slowly stalk Leon or shoot crossbows from a distance. Because of this, the vast majority of enemy encounters are really boring and not very memorable. There's much more variety to enemies like Regenerators and Garradors, as there's more to their AI than just slowly stalking Leon. But encounters like that are very few and far between. It also doesn't help that in a lot of instances, there are way too many enemies to fight in a single area. It's really tiresome in levels that just amount to dragged out fights with the same enemies for minutes on end. The worst example being the infamous water hallway in the castle. In this one area, you have to fight dozens of zealots while solving a number of small puzzles, all while protecting Ashley from taking damage or being kidnapped. I heard there's a trick to reducing the number of enemies in the area if you die a lot, but that just feels like a really annoying thing to do. And this is unfortunately two things that the remake did not fix, as there's still a lot of instances where the enemy AI acts stupid or you have to fight way too many enemies in one area. And that's really frustrating considering all the other improvements this remake makes. You'd think they would have taken the time to improve their behavior or make the battles drag out less. Unfortunately, it's more of the same. Stupidly killing themselves with their own traps, and areas that are dragged out with too many enemies. And the last thing to bring up is Leon's inability to hold his gun steady, resulting in your aim being thrown off. A problem that is very present in both the original and the remake. Not only is this a hindrance on the gameplay, it doesn't even make sense in universe. Leon was given special top-secret military training. He's a high-ranking government agent assigned on special missions no one else can do. He was trained to be the John Wick of the Resident Evil universe. You'd think this would allow him to hold his gun steady instead of fidgeting it around like he's drunk. You could be lining up a headshot or trying to shoot down a hanging treasure, but Leon will be swinging his gun the entire time, which results in accuracy being thrown off and ammo being wasted. Honestly, when I played through the remake, I turned on the assist aim feature because I could not be bothered to deal with this stupid weapon sway the entire time. And that's about everything there is to compare, so I suppose it's time to wrap things up. In spite of everything I've said throughout this video, I'm not trying to make the OG RE4 out to be terrible or something that more people should hate on. It's still something to appreciate and respect for how it changed the course of gaming and how it set the blueprint for so many future classics. There were just a lot of things Capcom could have improved on or fixed now that gaming has evolved further since the days of the original's release. And that's something they succeeded in doing with this remake. They took every aspect of the original's design and improved upon practically all of it. And even after completing the game once, it has so much replay value with the new features they added for post-game experiences. Unlockable perks that tweak the game in fun ways. A ton of shortcut and skips for the speedrunning community. Special weapons with exclusive upgrades and abilities. And the addition of the Mercenaries mode and future DLC content is bound to keep you coming back to this title. Resident Evil 4 Remake is worthy of the original's namesake in every way that matters. It stays faithful to the original while adding all sorts of new content, making it a refreshing experience. Making it one of Capcom's most exquisite triumphs to date. If by some chance you haven't checked it out yet, you absolutely need to get this game right now, because you're missing out on something truly spectacular. If you loved Resident Evil 4 back in the day, then this remake will make you love it all over again. Thanks for checking out my review. If you liked what you saw here and would like to support me, check out my Patreon in the description. Every little bit helps and I always appreciate those who support my work. Until next time, stay cool.